Okay, well, thanks for inviting us here so that we can fill you in on what we've been doing for the past several years. And it's a study of the effects of both shoreline hardening and watershed land use on nearshore habitats. So we're focusing on shallow waters, less than 2 meters deep, which are critical habitats for fisheries and migratory species. It's turning into a 7-year program. It started out as a 5-year grant. We got some extensions. We're pretty much done with the data collection phase and more into the analysis and writing phase. Most of the work is done, but we're still working on the data and discovering new things. So now it's a 7-year study with 19 co-PIs from 8 different institutions. Here's a list of the PIs and also some SERC postdocs worth mentioning: Matt Cornish, Chris Patrick, and Michael Hannum. The PIs are too numerous for me to read out loud. So the land use effects are compounded, of course, with stressors at the intertidal zone. And that's what we want to look at, the multiple stressors and how they interact. So the watershed, provides inputs of nutrients, sediments, and toxic substances. In the meantime, shoreline alterations like bulkhead and riprap revetments and living shorelines are affecting the nearshore habitat as well. And then we're also looking at the spread of invasive Phragmites in wetlands and how that affects the shore habitat. So just as a quick introduction, this is a profile of that shallow system that we're looking at with a natural kind of shoreline, a beach shoreline. And what's great about this habitat is the shallowness of it. It allows for SAV growth. SAV, submerged aquatic vegetation, of course, they're rooted in the sediment. They need enough light to get down to them. So shallow waters is where they grow. The shallow waters provide a refuge for small fish that are prey for the larger fisheries species, and also they're feeding grounds for wading birds. So another kind of natural sort of shoreline would be a tidal marsh shore, which again would have the benefits of the shallow refuges, but also has the tidal marsh surface, which is exploited by some organisms that swim up onto the marsh during high tide and then back down at low tide. And the marsh and the SAV as well provide organic matter through primary production. Now contrast those shorelines with a bulkhead. You put a bulkhead in and a lot of things happen. Of course, the motivation is to stop erosion of the land, which is of course being accentuated now as sea level rises faster and more people are moving into the nearshore zone. You put in a bulkhead and it reflects the waves. That's the whole idea. You want to get that energy away from the land, but the reflected waves create turbulence and can scour the sediment, creating deeper water. And so then you lose your shallow refuge for the SAV and the smaller fish and crustaceans. At the same time, if you put in a bulkhead, you basically eliminate the intertidal zone, which is where the tidal marsh would be. So effectively, you're wiping out this nearshore habitat that's so valuable. At least that's our concern. That's what we wanted to study. So an alternative to bulkheads is to use riprap revetment, and that's where you basically pile up rocks along the shore. And in contrast to a bulkhead, which is a flat surface, these rocks being kind of a jumbled surface, the waves that are reflected are less coherent and have less energy, and there's less scour. At least that's the idea. So the thought is that riprap revetment might have less impact than bulkhead. And we looked at that in our research. In addition, there's alternate approaches to armoring the shores to prevent erosion. And this is an example where you, instead of putting your riprap here against the shore, put it offshore to make a breakwater or sill, and then you can retain some of these nearshore habitats, even tidal marsh and the shallows, maybe SAV, depending on the conditions of the sediment. And this kind of approach is sometimes called living shoreline. But the term living shoreline really applies to a wide range of different sorts of designs. So looking at the effects of living shoreline was not a big emphasis of our project, but it is something that we looked at a bit. We did study bulkhead and riprap revetment quite a bit. So the approach that we used was to compare different shoreline types: natural marsh, Phragmites marsh, riprap revetment, bulkhead, and beach shorelines, in bays and sub-estuaries with watersheds that have differing land use compositions, forested land, residential development, and agricultural land. And the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic coastal bays is a great place to do that, because the complexity of the coastline results in there being lots of different sub-estuaries, each of which has its own unique watershed. So we could look for sub-estuaries that had different land use compositions in their watersheds, different kinds of shoreline hardening, and that's what we did. And when you look at all of these places, we're initially able to identify 142 systems that we could study, 128 in Chesapeake Bay, 14 in coastal and inland bays. We ended up sampling 50 different systems, and the watersheds are colored in this image. But we did modeling of data for many more than 50 sub-estuaries and shorelines even outside of the sub-estuaries. So I want to start by saying a little bit about the findings with water quality. The real take-home message is that the local land use matters. It's not just Pennsylvania and the Conowingo Dam. It's the local land use right around the sub-estuary makes a difference. So that means that management actions that are taken on the local scale can make a difference in the local waters. And so to get a look at the data then, this is the total nitrogen concentration in the water versus the land use percentages. And these total nitrogen values are averages within, for samples at different locations within each sub-estuary for the late summer and early fall, which we found was the time when the total nitrogen concentrations reached their peak in the water column. So total nitrogen concentration versus the percentage of cropland. You can see total nitrogen concentration increases as the percentage of cropland goes up to a maximum of 60, what we sampled. No surprise, you'd expect cropland to be a source of nitrogen, but again it shows how important the local watershed is. Total nitrogen versus percentage developed land also increases as developed land increases, but with a shallower slope. So it seems from this that you get twice as much nitrogen in the sub-estuary for every acre of cropland than you would for an acre of developed land, at least among the watersheds that we looked at. A similar kind of set of graphs looking at total phosphorus versus land use percentages. Total phosphorus concentrations increase with percent cropland, but we didn't see a significant trend with percentage of developed land. And then, let's see, chlorophyll versus the different land types. It was very interesting to me to see that chlorophyll concentrations increased at about the same rate with percent cropland and percent developed land, even though we saw different responses with the total nitrogen and total phosphorus. So there's some things going on there that would be interesting to pursue some more. I mentioned that we looked at the late summer and early fall for to characterize the different sub-estuaries. And here we have chlorophyll data from that time period shown in red. And for comparison, the earlier time period from April to June, when you'd expect to see spring phytoplankton blooms, we actually saw that the chlorophyll within the sub-estuaries tended to be higher during that later time period. That just seems to be the time when the local eutrophication really sets up. Okay, so another way to look at water quality is to look at the contaminants in the fish tissues, the things that get into the fish. And so we looked at nearshore fish, and here's some examples of the data for, in this case, fish tissue total PCB versus the percentage of developed land in the watershed. And different species of fish. Let's look at the white perch first. If you look at the total PCB content versus percent developed, you see that as the amount of developed land goes up, the amount of PCBs go up. Although it seems to be driven a lot by one data point where the most highly developed watershed we looked at. And also you notice that the response of white perch is more than the Atlantic silver sides or the mummy chunks, the two other fish that we have on the slide here. But both of them similarly showed an increase in PCB as the percentage of developed land goes up. This has been shown before, but it's interesting to see that the white perch, which are higher on the food chain, show that concentrating effect that you see with PCBs as you go up the food chain, and to quantify it as a response to the local watershed. We looked at other contaminants as well. I'm going to show you one other one because it seemed to have a contrasting behavior, and that's the mercury in fish tissue. And we did not see a response of mercury, a positive response with percent developed land. Quite the contrary, we found that as the percentage of marsh shoreline went up, there was some tendency for mercury to go up, although it's not so clear as with the PCB trends in developed land. So looking at the white perch, which would be expected to have higher mercury content, in fact do, than the other ones because of their position being higher on the food chain. You see for most of the samples there seems to be a trend with mercury content increasing, except for one point which kind of totally ruins the trend statistically. But we need to look at these data a little bit more carefully. We just got them recently, and so we're still working on it. But we think that it's possible that mercury availability is increased with marsh shoreline because of mercury methylation being stimulated by sulfate reduction, and tidal marshes being a site of sulfate reduction. So that may be the explanation for that.